Hello there, sword fans. Today I'm going to do a review on this sword right here. This is a review sample that was sent to me from Jkoo swords. If you're unfamiliar with them, I'll link them in the description down below. My son apparently is a big fan. Though I've done this intro so many times, I'm not going to edit it out. The basic gist is that this is a review sample. It means I didn't spend any money on it. It was sent to me for free to do this review. If you think that makes me biased, then there you go. Jkoo has actually sent me a number of swords, and all of them have been review samples. But I don't get paid to do the reviews, so I'm not exactly where that lies in the realm of making me biased or not, but I guess that's all the bits you need to know. Except for one other thing, which is that I'm not an authority figure in the subject matter of swords. I'm a collector and enthusiast, and you should kind of keep all those contexts in mind as you hear me ramble and chat about this particular sword. On the subject of this particular sword, it is $260 from my understanding. That would be what it would cost prior to shipping if you were to buy one from Jkoo swords directly. Again, I'll link them in the description down below, as well as specs on this particular sword and whatnot. If you want this one, I imagine I could piece it back together for you or get you something very, very similar, but it isn't exactly a model or something that I can link to directly. You'd have to have these pieces chosen and such. But anyway, I was told $260. It is supposedly made from 9260 spring steel. I don't know if that's true or not because I have no way of validating, but I have no reason to doubt it. Anyway, that's the steel that it's supposed to be made from. And all of those things are what I'm going to keep in mind as I evaluate, do I personally think the sword is worth it or not, which I'll touch on at the end. Before I do that, though, I'm just going to go over kind of the bits, bobs, fits, features, and all that kind of stuff, and show you them in closer detail, because I think that's probably what I add more to in the conversation than anything else. So, without further ado, jumping into the review. All right, the kashira, the pommel, the end cap, the bit right here. So the first thing I want to talk on is just that I don't like them. And that's an aesthetic, subjective, purely wham, wham, wham for me type thing. And that is, these are kind of a copper base with, I don't know if it's finger paints, electroplating, what's done to get this gold and silver patterning on here, but I don't think the casting is particularly good. I don't think it emulates the kind of historic pieces that it's trying to draw inspiration from. I really think that it's out of all the fittings that are made, these kind of copper, and they happen, I think, be the more expensive ones. These copper with additional embellishments and stuff on here are just the poorest representation of what they're trying to emulate. And it's fitting that my son is crying in the background, because that's really what I'm doing. It's just not to my personal taste, and I hope that explains why. I'll try not to be biased about the rest of it, but I really don't aesthetically like the choice on the fittings, maybe with the exception of the mediocre. But that's just purely subjective. If you happen to like them, more power to you. I think these are among the more expensive things, but anyway, there you go. I happen to just not. So with that in mind, the other bits, how well does it function? Well, the transitions near the kashira were a little bunchy. You can see that this kind of last bit is tied up. It didn't line up exactly perfectly well. It's held on pretty well after all of the abuse and stuff. You can see that it moves around a little bit, which is not all that bad, but maybe a dab of glue would resolve that if the sword weren't already in a broken state. Anyway, the ito bunches up a little bit, and I would also note that I didn't use this sword terribly much. I didn't have a ton of time to really do much with it. Rather, the time I had, I chose not to spend doing a lot of EI with it. But I did do some, and you can see that the patina on this copper fitting has already started to wear off a little bit, so it strikes me as these are probably not terribly durable, at least in terms of the patina. Any patina will come off, so it's not a surprise that it did, but I suppose know that this one seems to age pretty quickly, or rather the patina, the coloring seems to come off pretty quick, and the bare copper underneath is exposed, which honestly I think is an aesthetic improvement, but again, my taste might be not the ones to look to on this one. Anyway, the kashira held on, which is a good sign, and the ito, well, bunchy, and the transition not particularly great. It's also not the worst that I've seen, not the worst that I've seen from Jkoo either, and it held together through some very, very abusive stuff. In fact, the ito, if I move on to that, is something kind of worth giving some degree of praise to Jkoo for. So again, this is not a terribly expensive sword, but the ito held up really well. It was tight. It was good. The diamonds are not great, but they are, I would say, an improvement on what I see conventionally on swords in this price point. And the ito is just very, very tight. It's held up well. It's gone through various climate changes even since I've gotten it. It's now very hot and very humid in Minnesota. And it was very dry and somewhat cold when I got this sword, and the ito has stayed consistently tight and good. It's a very comfortable ito as well. This cotton, well, it ages and kind of gets a ruggedness to it after being used. It frays quickly. I kind of like the aesthetic, the way it absorbs oil in your hands, and the way it frays and stuff kind of gives it a rough and tumble kind of look. I think that's maybe doesn't go well with these fittings. Again, the stab, I'm not going to harp on the fittings too much, but I do like the cotton Ito. Know that it ages this way and will likely absorb a lot of oil and stuff from your hands, but I happen to like it. I like the way it looks, and this is tied very, very tightly. It's pretty good, and it also feels really comfortable in my hand. This handle is actually a little big, but I can't say that I minded it. It's a pretty sizable handle. I wouldn't mind if it was a little skinnier. Maybe the cotton could be tied a little tighter, or maybe I'm not exactly sure what could be done, but it seems like it's just a little rounder than I'd like. It could be thinned out just a little bit. Still, feels overall comfortable in my hands. I like the feel of the Ito. It held on, it stayed tight. All of that deserves high praise because it's a relatively inexpensive sword, and I was relatively abusive with it. Anyway, again, diamonds, they're misshapen, but not not so much so that it's the worst that I've seen. The Samegawa is small nodules throughout, not something that I'm expecting a whole lot of, large, impressive nodules on a sword of this price. The Minuki, I think, are actually nice. So I'm going to say something nice about the fittings. I do like the detailing in the Minuki, and I think they're small and elegant enough looking. It can make out some casting detail. I can kind of tell what they are. I think that they're the highlight of the fitting set to me. All right, we'll move on to the fuchi area right here. So there are some transition ledges here, and it's more pronounced kind of on the flats of the blade. This is maybe a little rounder fitting than it should be. I also think it's weird how it kind of cuts in. It should be kind of going the other way, but it narrows towards the top, which is kind of an odd look. Anyway, the basic gist is there are some transitions here. It's not actually too bad. The Ito lines up reasonably well, but along the flats I can feel kind of a ledge here. I didn't notice any discomfort in using it though. So if I choke up on the tsuba, on the guard right here, it doesn't cause me any discomfort. The edges are rounded enough to not really make an issue. And again, the patina has worn off somewhat around this kind of ledge area. But it's there. It's not perfect. It's not ideal, but it also wasn't uncomfortable to use. So in fairness, the handle from a pragmatic standpoint was comfortable and held up really well. It deserves a thumbs up in that regard. I'm going to touch briefly on the tsuba here, and one thing that I like is that it has some detailing all the way around the outside rim of the tsuba. Now, this is something that doesn't often get cast in, or however it's made. Very often they leave these edges flat, and in fairness, in Japanese swords, sometimes they were flat. But here, I can see that there is detailing all around the outside rim. Muddy as it is, it's still there, and I appreciate that artistic embellishment. I can make out casting lines and seams and stuff like that, but overall, it's still something pleasant to look at. And from a practical standpoint, nothing bites me. There's nothing sharp on it. Nothing cuts my hand or anything. From a practitioner standpoint, it's also reasonably comfortable. I did develop a slight bit of wiggle after a lot of abusive testing, but it remained tight most of the way through the testing. So again, tip of my hat to Jkoo. The assembly of the hilt actually held together really well throughout this process. Now I'm going to talk briefly about the Habaki. That's this blade collar right here. And there's a couple bits to note about it. One, aesthetically, if you like it, that's great. I happen to kind of like it from a distance. Up close, though, I can make out some of the seams, the soldering lines and stuff like that. And it doesn't look as clean as maybe I might like it to. But it is a different thing than the common brass Habaki, which if you've watched my content before, you know I'm starting to not like seeing in swords. So something different is appreciated. That said, it's not a two-piece. It's soldered together. It's not a two-piece Habaki. And what it's trying to emulate or look like, it's missing the mark aesthetically a little bit. But it is a different aesthetic, and that much is nice. The downside is the execution here. There are sharp ledges, not sharp to your hand or something. It's not going to hurt you. But what happens is if you try to sheathe the sword, it would catch and run the ledge of the scabbard, and it would be a stopping point that would kind of make that last little bit. You'd have to turn the sword and wiggle it to make sure it was in alignment before you could put it in. Now, I've done enough EI where basically the metal has just scratched off the inside of the scabbard where it was running into it, and now it sheathes relatively smoothly. But initially, I was running into problems where it was kind of knocking on the scabbard, and it was kind of an inconvenience. And now it's unfortunate, while it's together at the moment, it's still because it's been shoved in enough and kind of carved out its own little space rather than being fitted properly in the first place. So not an ideal thing. If you happen to like it, I guess over time it didn't become too much of a problem, but it's worth noting that you might have to do a couple hours worth of EI before it carves itself out a nice little pocket, or maybe it'll crack your sire, maybe there'll be some other problem. It should be fit correctly. In this case it wasn't, but it kind of worked itself out. I suppose that brings us to the saya. The tension is still good, and it was when I got the sword, apart from obviously noting that the habaki would kind of whack on the side of the scabbard when it went in, but otherwise tensioning was pretty good, which is impressive because a lot of times, well, I don't know about impressive, but it's hard to meet that expectation is what I should say. There's a lot of temperature changes from where it comes in China to where it came in Minnesota, particularly at the time of year this came, and so it's no surprise that, you know, things can tighten and loosen and all that kind of stuff with the humidity changes. So this is a common thing to be loose, and it was just at the right tension, so tip of my hat there. There is a horn koiguchi in this area right here. Down at the kojiri right here, though, I can see there's like excess residue paint or something like that. Something unsightly is lingering on the end here. You don't notice it so much unless you look straight at it, but I suppose that's what I do in these reviews. So there's some residue. It's not polished off as well as I might like, but it looks like there's some sort of horn cap here. The lacquering on here doesn't look particularly great. There's, you know, little ripples and stuff in the surface, and this appears to be, I think it's a wood, or maybe, I'm not sure what kind of koiguchi or kurigata it is, this little ring right here that holds your sageo on. The paint is chipped and stuff like that because these little shirodome were loose, they weren't glued in, and so they rattle around and whack on stuff, and now I can start to see that some of the paint is chipping, and maybe this is just a plastic thing. I'm not exactly sure what this is made out of. It has now chipped, and the saya has scratched a little bit because these things bounce around and whack on it. Anyway, the scabbard did its job. It also, well, it rattles now. It didn't really rattle so much when I got the sword originally. It was actually fit pretty well. Transition-wise, it looks okay. You know, it juts in. There's some odd angles and stuff here aesthetically that I find less than pleasing, but in a sword for $260, I'm really looking for the main functions to be comfortable, for it to be sharp, for it to be one piece and function at a base level rather than have everything perfectly nipped and tucked. Of course, it's nice if it is. In this case, I won't get too mad that it isn't. It's just some odd angles, but nothing really that you shouldn't expect in a sword, you know, at any price point, honestly. It seems like even the $2,000 ones can screw some of that stuff up. Now I'm going to talk about the blade, the pointy stabby part. So this sword measured at 2 pounds 11 ounces, which is impressive because it was a 29 something inch blade, and that happens to be the size that I generally like working with. It lets me not cheat at some of my EI, but it's also not so long that I have to really work at it. It's a comfortable length for me to work with, and it's uncommon for me to get review samples that are that size. So I did like the length of the blade. The habaki catching, I noted earlier, was the only real disruption that I noticed in trying to practice EI with it. The blade itself, it's obviously in a diminished state, but when it came to me, it was not, and it was sharp and nice. The planes on it were relatively flat. The edges felt really quite sharp. It wasn't dull or anything like that. It's made out of 9260 spring steel, and from what I understand, it's also through hardened, so I don't see any aesthetics in the blade. It's a shiny kind of strip of steel that's sharp like a razor, right? So while I can make out the ledges, some of them appear soft, but nevertheless, overall, it just didn't have anything really to look at. There wasn't any hamon. I don't see any banding effects in the metal. There's really not much in terms of aesthetics on the polish of the steel to look at. The blade itself, though, was imposing and thick and stout, and I will put the specifications down below. There's just not a whole lot to talk about in terms of the overall fit and finish. The Kasaki had a yokote on it that was geometric in nature. It's kind of not just polished on as a line, which some people like. It wasn't exactly even or terribly crisp, but in the sense of a $260 sword, I don't know exactly what I'm expecting here. The planes were flat, the edge was sharp, the blade was straight. It didn't come with any rust or anything like that on it, and so overall I would say it meets expectations there. But it's even nice with a through hardened blade to see some sort of aesthetic banding. Sometimes that can be brought out in the polish. For this price point, doesn't make sense necessarily to put the work in to be able to see that, but sometimes some cool effects can be under the hood with the right person working the polish to bring them out. Anyway, not the case here, but it was sharp and shiny, and so it was good enough. I'll move on to talking about cutting with it, and in that sense, cutting went actually pretty well. It was really quite good, and then it went very poorly, obviously, at the end. So cutting, I moved through a variety of different targets: bottles, tatami mats, pool noodles. Then after doing some of those types of cutting, which I would say it actually worked out pretty well. It didn't do as good as I thought. It has a really keen edge, so I thought it would work better on the pool noodle, but I had some trouble. I'll chalk that up to user error. Bottles, it did fine. I tried cutting into the stem of bottles just to see if the edge would diminish or crack. It didn't. Tatami, I found it easy to maneuver and handle. My form is bad, but It cut through the tatami relatively easily, and those are used Japanese tatami mats, so they're the tougher ones to cut, and it still moved through really, really well. I had no problems doing it. From there, I went to abusive stuff. So note that the transition here is now I'm doing abusive things. There's been a lot of chatter on the internet recently about if cutting wood is abusive. I suppose that depends on your expectations. If your expectation is that the sword remain perfectly sharp and stay completely together with no rattles, well, a couple strikes, fair. But repeated hard strikes into even a medium soft wood will result in likely some things loosening up and needing to be keened up, sharpened, or straightened and that kind of stuff. And those are things that you might experience on the battlefield, but that's not what this video is about. Suffice to say, I would consider it abusive. That's why I'm noting it. I'm striking it bad at a very stout piece of wood with the intention specifically of punishing the sword. So that's I suppose the line there. Anyway, I cut into logs several times. It held up really well. I took it to more abusive targets. It basically held up well. I did a lot of wood cutting, and it absorbed shock really well. I didn't feel it a lot in my hands. The sword, the hilt, all of that stayed in overall good order.
There.
I then moved on to the croquet stake of doom, so to speak. And I did a couple strikes in it, and initially it immediately scuffed the edge substantially. So through the wood cutting, it dulled a little bit, but still had a little bit of bite left on the edge. But as soon as I took it in the croquet stake with a kind of medium hard strike, it immediately took chunks of metal out of the sword, which is to be expected, but it was a pretty hefty chunk. Now, I had thought maybe I'm going to strike it into here and then take it back and chop some wood and see how well it does, but I didn't get that far. And so up into the croquet stick of doom, I would say the sword was performing spectacularly. I was really impressed with the edge retention. I was impressed with how much the sword stayed straight and how well it absorbed shock and how comfortable it was in my hand. But basically a few strikes into the croquet stick of doom and the sword broke, which is not great. It absorbed all the shock prior spectacularly well, and then failed catastrophically after a few strikes. Now, I would have hoped that the sword would have, had chunks or diminished or lost its edge, but not broken. I didn't even have to flip it around and strike it on the spine. It broke, cutting into the croquet stake. And I later repeated just to see if maybe there was some sort of structural weak spot. The grain structure looked good. I didn't spot anything terribly problematic, so I took it and I did it again. And it took a lot more strikes than it did the first time, but there's quite a bit less sword on it. So, and it broke. It broke without having to flip it around and strike the spine of the blade here. So I don't know if it's too hard or something, or that it's just particularly less resilient to metal objects. I'm not entirely sure, but I would say that it did not hold up particularly well on the striking the croquet stake of doom. And other swords have failed maybe pretty quickly on that target, but very often I have to turn them around and start striking the spine. This one, several whacks in, it just failed and kind of flung off in a helicopter of death. So that was the end of the sword. Now, do I think it held up well? Yeah, I mean, I was really, really impressed, like I said, up to that point, and hopefully you're not striking metal poles with gusto, and if you are, then I guess you should expect similar results, though I would argue at that point they happened maybe quicker than they should have for a sword this thickness, this size, and this material. Alright, sword friends, so hopefully the ramble up until this point has given you all the information you need to know about if this is worth your money or not. I'm going to try and answer the same question, and the short answer is no. And it's because the blade broke when it did. If it had lasted 24 more strikes on the edge and then been flipped around and struck on the spine and broken, I'd say yes, but it didn't. And I it's my assumption that if this blade were maybe made of 1060, I would probably lose some of the edge retention, and the blade might take a bend or a set easier than it did here, because this blade had remarkable edge retention and stayed straight all throughout. It didn't take any bends whatsoever. And so I would rather lose that and jeopardize taking a bend or a twist or something in favor of having, more resilience to catastrophically stupid things like whacking a solid metal stake. So breaking when it did is why I'd say no, but if I switch it out to 1060, I bet I could get it for the same price, and I bet it would give me a little bit more resilience to that type of activity. It's worth noting as well that if you're doing soft to medium target cutting, bottles, pool noodles, tatami mats, saplings, small green bamboo, I don't suspect that this sword would give you any trouble, and I'd have no fear in recommending it. But to me, I'd just want a little bit more edge in the resilience factor, and that's what I kind of lost here. So I don't think it's bad, but it did break sooner than I thought it should on some of the ultimate dumb stuff, and that's why I would swap it out. I'd also incidentally swap out obviously the fittings, and I'd skip this 2-piece Habaki in favor of something that's a 1-piece and probably would fit a little bit better. Those would be the changes that I would make. As it is, I don't think it's a terrible deal or a rip-off, but it's worth noting that if you're going to do ultimate dumb things, that there's a breaking point for it, and it happens spectacularly and quickly. So with a 1060, 1090, maybe even a T10 blade, I don't suspect that it would have the same problem, though that's pure speculation on my part. Anyway, that's all I got. Hopefully the video has been interesting. I will link Jkoo's website and the specifications for this particular sword in the description down below. If you have questions or you think I'm off on anything, throw them in the commentary down below, and I will do my best to answer. Special thanks as well to Jkoo Swords for sending me this sword for the purposes of review and destruction. And that's all I got. As always, cheers, and thanks for watching.